There is a particular kind of silence that follows a person home from a disaster, not the silence of peace or rest, the silence of something pressed down so hard for so long that it begins to reshape the bones of a person from the inside. This is the real case of a survivor who carried 21 secrets, not metaphors, not impressions, but documented, buried, suppressed facts, and who spent the final 30 years of his life making certain that none of them would ever surface. The air around his story still carries the cold of it, something mineral and damp, the way a basement smells after it has flooded and been sealed shut before it could properly dry. Wherever you are watching this right now, whatever city, whatever room, whatever hour the clock on your wall is reading, we invite you to leave it in the comments below. There is something appropriate about knowing where people sit when they listen to a story like this one, because geography matters, because place leaves its mark on the people who pass through it, sometimes permanently. The year is 1908. The city is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To understand what this story is truly about, you must first understand what Pittsburgh was in 1908, not the abstract economic fact of it, the steel, the rivers, the industrial output, but the physical, daily, sensory reality of living inside it. Pittsburgh, in the early years of the 20th century, was a city perpetually obscured. Smoke from more than 500 industrial furnaces and rolling mills hung low over the downtown basin in a permanent layer that turned noon into a kind of gray twilight. Residents had learned to carry handkerchiefs not for sentiment, but for utility, pressing them over their mouths on particularly heavy mornings when the particulate count in the air made breathing a conscious and labored effort. The buildings on Fifth Avenue, the fine ones with their carved limestone facades, were permanently stained a color between charcoal and rust, as though the city's prosperity had been painted on in soot and left to weather. The rivers, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, the Ohio, did not run clear. They ran brown and occasionally iridescent, carrying industrial residue in slow, heavy coils toward the west. Children who grew up along the riverbanks in the working neighborhoods of the South Side and Lawrenceville could identify a steel mill upstream by the particular color the water turned on a given afternoon. They had names for the shades. They treated it the way children in other cities treated weather. And yet Pittsburgh was also, in 1908, a city of extraordinary cultural ambition. Andrew Carnegie had already given the city its great library, its music hall, its museum of natural history. The Pittsburgh Survey, a landmark social science investigation funded by the Russell Sage Foundation, was underway that very year, dispatching researchers into the mills and tenements to document living and working conditions with a methodological rigor that had rarely been applied to an American city before. There was a contradictory energy to Pittsburgh in those years. It was aware of its ugliness and proud of it simultaneously. It understood itself as a place where things were made, where the making was hard, and where the hardness was a kind of identity. It is into this city in the spring of that year that we must place one man. His name was Edmund Harlan Voss. He was 34 years old in 1908. He had been born in Allegheny City, which by that point had been absorbed into Pittsburgh proper through annexation, a fact he mentioned with mild bitterness in the one extended interview he ever gave to a local church newspaper in 1921. He described himself, in that interview, as a man who had always been on the edge of things, not marginalized, not excluded, but positioned at the perimeter of whatever room he happened to occupy. He was trained as a civil engineer, having completed his degree at what was then the Western University of Pennsylvania in 1896. He had worked for a decade in bridge survey and assessment, traveling throughout western Pennsylvania and into Ohio, cataloging the structural integrity of county bridges and railroad trestles for both private firms and occasional municipal contracts. It was disciplined, technical work. It suited him. His colleagues from that period described him, in the limited records that survive, as methodical and quiet. Not unsociable, he attended the professional dinners. He joined the Allegheny County Engineers Society. He was a member of a Presbyterian congregation on the north side, but fundamentally interior. One associate, a man named Carol Briggs, who later became the chief structural engineer for the city's Department of Public Works, wrote in a letter to a mutual friend that Voss was the kind of man you could spend an entire afternoon working alongside and come away knowing almost nothing about. He said it without judgment. He seemed to mean it as a description of a particular professional temperament rather than a personal failing. Voss was unmarried. He had been engaged once, in 1902, to a woman named Margaret Elspeth Dowd, the daughter of a merchant on Butler Street. The engagement lasted 11 months before it was quietly dissolved. The reasons were never recorded anywhere. Margaret Dowd married a hardware wholesaler from Shadyside in 1904, had 3 children, and appears to have had no further contact with Voss for the remainder of either of their lives. He does not mention her in the 1921 interview. He does not mention her in any document that survives. He lived alone in a second-floor apartment on Caldwell Street in the Hill District, in a building that has long since been demolished. His apartment, according to a landlady's account from 1923, contained a drafting table, a great many books on engineering and natural history, a collection of river stones arranged on the windowsill by apparent geological category, and very little else of personal note. No photographs of family were displayed, no decorative objects except the stones. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Florinda Calvert, said that Voss was the most orderly tenant she had ever kept. He paid on time, he made no noise, he left no trace of himself in the shared spaces of the building. She said, with what sounds in transcription like a combination of admiration and mild unease, that she sometimes forgot he was there. In the late winter of 1908, Voss accepted a contract with the Fairchild Consolidated Mining Company, a mid-sized coal operation based in Connellsville that had recently expanded its holdings into the rural counties east of Pittsburgh. The contract was a bridge and trestle survey for a new rail spur that Fairchild was extending to reach a recently opened shaft mine near a small settlement called Dunbarton Hollow in the wooded hill country of Fayette County. The work was expected to take approximately 6 weeks. Voss would travel with a small team, a junior engineer named Thomas Greer, a laborer named Pavel Szczepanski who handled the equipment, and a local guide hired through the Fairchild Company who knew the terrain. He left Pittsburgh on the 14th of March. The weather that week had been alternating between late winter cold and the first damp warmth of early spring, the kind of weather that makes the ground uncertain underfoot and fills the creek beds in the wooded hollows with fast brown runoff. He took the Baltimore and Ohio line to Connellsville and then a company wagon north and east into the hills. He kept a field journal, as was his professional habit. The early entries in that journal, the first 10 days, survive and are held in a small archive at the University of Pittsburgh's Hillman Library. They are meticulous, technical, and almost entirely impersonal. Elevations, soil conditions, bridge dimensions, weather observations. The handwriting is precise and economical, the letters formed with the clean, practiced consistency of a man who had spent years recording measurements. There is in those early entries one brief personal observation. On March 19th, Voss wrote, "The hollow country here is very quiet. The trees are still bare, and the ridges are close on both sides of the trackbed. In the late afternoon the light goes quickly, and the sound of the creek can be heard from a considerable distance. I find the quiet agreeable." That is the last personal observation in the field journal for more than 3 weeks. What follows in the journal, from the 19th through the 8th of April, is a continuous technical record of the survey work, bearing loads, span calculations, timber condition assessments, soil core samples taken near the planned bridge footings. The work was apparently proceeding on schedule. The team had established a base camp near Dunbarton Hollow in a set of company-owned structures that had been used the previous season by a prospecting team. The structures consisted of a main cabin, a storage shed, and a separate small building that had functioned as an assay office. And then, on the 8th of April, the journal stops entirely. Mid-entry. The last line Voss wrote that day is a partial notation, a span measurement, a fraction, and then nothing. The pen appears to have been set down with some deliberateness, because there is no smear or drag mark, just a clean stop. He did not return to Pittsburgh on schedule. When the 6th week passed with no word and no arrival, a representative of the Fairchild Company made inquiries at the Connellsville office. The company wagon driver who had delivered the team to Dunbarton Hollow at the beginning of the contract was sent back up into the hills to check on the progress. What the driver found when he reached the camp on the 24th of April has been described in 3 separate accounts. The driver's own statement to the Fairchild Company, a report filed with the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, and a brief article in the Uniontown Evening Standard. The accounts agree on the following. The camp was in good order. The equipment was stored correctly. The food supplies were diminished but not exhausted. The field notes and survey materials were stacked and organized on the table in the main cabin. There was no sign of violence. There was no sign of fire or flooding or any other natural disturbance. Thomas Greer was gone. Pavel Szczepanski was gone. The local guide, a man recorded only as R. Holloway in the Fairchild Company records, was gone. And Edmund Harlan Voss was sitting in the main cabin, alone, at the table in full daylight, with his coat on and his hat in his lap, staring at the opposite wall. The wagon driver, whose name was James Aldrich, said in his statement to the company that when he entered the cabin and spoke Voss's name, Voss did not react immediately. He said the man turned his head very slowly, as though the movement required considerable effort, and looked at Aldrich for what felt like a long time, without appearing to recognize him. Then, Aldrich said, something shifted behind the man's eyes. He used the phrase, like a lamp being turned up. And Voss stood, picked up his hat, and said in a perfectly normal voice that he was ready to go. He picked up his field journal and his personal bag. He walked to the wagon and climbed up without assistance. He did not look back at the camp. Aldrich said that during the 2.5-hour journey back to Connellsville, Voss spoke exactly 3 sentences. He asked what the date was. He asked whether there had been rain in Connellsville recently, and he said at some point during the latter half of the drive, looking out at the passing trees, "The other men will not be coming back." He did not elaborate. He did not look at Aldrich when he said it. Aldrich, by his own account, was frightened enough by the statement and by the general quality of the man beside him that he did not ask anything further. In Connellsville, Voss was examined by a company physician named Dr. August Reinhardt. The examination notes from that visit survive in a partial form in the Fayette County Medical Society archive. Reinhardt recorded that Voss was physically present but psychologically distant and disordered. The phrase appears in quotation marks in Reinhardt's own notes, suggesting he was uncertain about its clinical precision, but could find no better term. Voss had lost an estimated 14 to 18 pounds. There were abrasions on his hands and forearms consistent with sustained outdoor physical labor or extended contact with rough surfaces, though their pattern was irregular. Reinhardt noted that Voss's fingernails on both hands had been worn down to the quick, with bruising beneath 3 of them on his right hand, as though they had been pressed or driven against a hard surface with great force. Voss offered no explanation for any of this. When Reinhardt asked him directly what had occurred during the missing weeks, Voss said with perfect composure that he did not think he was able to discuss it at that time. Reinhardt wrote in his notes, "Patient is coherent and physically mobile. No fever, no apparent head trauma. Eyes track correctly. Speech is unimpaired. However, there is a quality of deliberate containment to his manner that I find more concerning than agitation would be. He is not distressed in an outward sense. He appears to be controlling something very carefully." Voss was transported back to Pittsburgh 2 days later. The Fayette County Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons inquiry into Thomas Greer, Pavel Szczepanski, and the guide recorded as R. Holloway. The inquiry remained open for 11 months before being administratively closed without resolution. None of the 3 men were ever found. Pittsburgh received Voss back with something less than ceremony and something more than indifference. His landlady, Mrs. Calvert, noted in her account from 1923 that he arrived at the Colwell Street apartment on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, thinner and quieter than she remembered him, carrying only his personal bag. He thanked her for holding the apartment. He went upstairs. She heard him moving around for a short time, and then she heard nothing. For the following 3 weeks, Voss left the apartment rarely. Mrs. Calvert brought food to his door twice in the first week because she had not seen him go out and felt a generalized concern for his welfare that she was characteristically unable to articulate with any precision. She said he answered the door promptly, thanked her, and appeared to be in reasonable physical condition, though she noticed his hands. He kept them slightly curled, she said, and he moved them with an odd carefulness, as though they had been injured and the injury was not fully healed. He was always dressed, always composed. He did not look the way she expected a man to look after whatever had happened to him. He looked, she said, like a man who had made a very precise decision about his own face and was keeping to it. Voss returned to work in late May of 1908, approximately 6 weeks after coming back from Fayette County. He did not return to Fairchild Consolidated, who had, with some corporate delicacy, informed him that the contract had been suspended pending the outcome of the sheriff's inquiry. He found work instead with a Pittsburgh municipal engineering firm, a smaller outfit called Hadley & Sons that handled mostly urban infrastructure assessment, drainage systems, retaining walls, the structural evaluation of older commercial buildings. The work kept him within the city. He did not take any contracts that required extended time in the field outside of Pittsburgh for the rest of his career. His colleagues at Hadley & Sons described him, across several accounts that were gathered informally by a local journalist named Florence Pemberton in the early 1920s, a journalist who never published her findings, for reasons we will return to, as a capable and reliable engineer who had become, over time, noticeably more particular about certain things. He would not work underground. This was understood and accommodated without discussion. If a job required descending into a basement, a utility tunnel, or a culvert, Voss directed and supervised from above and sent a younger colleague down. He never explained this. No one asked him to. He had also developed by 1910 or so a habit of arriving at the office well before anyone else. He was typically there when the first other employee arrived, and the office manager, a man named Harold Fitch, noted that the gas lamp in Voss's private workroom was frequently burning when Fitch arrived at 7 in the morning, suggesting Voss had been there for some time already. When Fitch once commented on this, mildly and without any particular intention, Voss said only that he had always been an early riser. Fitch said it was the particular quality of attention with which Voss received even this small casual remark, a fraction of a pause, a slight shift of posture, a look that Fitch described as momentary but acute, that made him feel he had unintentionally asked something he should not have. There were other things. Voss had, by all accounts, been a moderate but consistent social participant before 1908. The professional dinners, the church, the occasional evening at the Engineers' Society. After his return, this participation contracted. He resigned from the Engineers' Society in 1909 without explanation. He stopped attending services at the North Side Church, transferring his membership to a smaller congregation in his own neighborhood, where he could, apparently, sit near the back and leave without prolonged interaction. When the Pittsburgh Survey published its findings in 1909 and 1910 to considerable public attention, Voss was one of several local engineers who might naturally have been drawn into the subsequent municipal discussions. He was not. He did not attend the public forums. He did not write letters to the engineering journals. He had, for all professional and civic purposes, made himself smaller, but it was not, crucially, the contraction of a man who was unwell in any visible or diagnosable sense. He continued to work. He continued to meet his professional obligations with precision and competence. He paid his debts. He was, by all external measures, functioning. What he had become was specifically and deliberately less visible. There is a difference between a man who cannot manage his life and a man who has decided with great care to manage his life in a way that minimizes exposure. Edmund Voss had become the second kind of man. And that, in retrospect, is the detail that distinguishes this story from a simple account of trauma and its aftermath. He was not hiding from his own distress. He was hiding from something else. Florence Pemberton was 26 years old when she first encountered the name Edmund Voss in 1919. She was a reporter for the Pittsburgh Gazette, one of a small number of women working in the city's daily press at that point, and she had developed a particular interest in what she described in her private notebooks, which were donated to the Carnegie Library's Pennsylvania room by her estate in 1967, as cases of structured silence. She meant by this phrase instances where an absence of information had been produced not by the natural decay of records, but by an active and sustained effort to prevent certain facts from entering the historical record. She had encountered the name Voss through a different story entirely, a follow-up piece she was researching on industrial accidents in rural Fayette County, prompted by a mine collapse in 1919 that had killed 7 men near Connellsville. In the process of reviewing older Fayette County records, she came across the 1908 sheriff's inquiry into the disappearance of Greer, Szczepanski, and the guide Holloway. The inquiry file was thin, a single folder, largely empty, but it contained a reference to the Fairchild Company's own internal report, a document Pemberton traced to the company's Connellsville office, which had not been destroyed when Fairchild was absorbed by a larger conglomerate in 1914. The Fairchild internal report is the first of the 21 secrets this story concerns. It was a 4-page document prepared by the company's legal office in the summer of 1908, clearly in anticipation of potential liability arising from the missing men. It described the events at Dunbarton Hollow in terms that were deliberately vague on specifics, while being unusually precise on one point. It stated that Edmund Voss had submitted a written account of the events to the Fairchild Company within 2 weeks of his return, and that this account had been received, reviewed, and retained internally for legal purposes. The written account is not in the folder. It has never been found in any archive. The Fairchild internal report references it 3 times without quoting it, and explicitly notes that it was not suitable for transmission to external parties, including law enforcement, without review by counsel. Pemberton recognized immediately what this meant. Voss had told the story, once, in writing, to a company that had buried it. She went to see him. The meeting took place in October of 1919 at the Colwell Street apartment. Voss was still there, 11 years after his return, in the same rooms. Pemberton's account of the meeting, which she recorded in her private notebook within hours of leaving, is one of the most carefully observed documents in this entire case. She described Voss, then 45, as lean and very still. She said he moved around his apartment with an economy of motion that reminded her, she wrote, of a man navigating a familiar space in the dark. Not uncertain, but careful, as though unnecessary movement had long since been edited out. His hair had gone predominantly grey. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who had spent a great deal of time outdoors, weathered, strong, marked by old scarring along the knuckles, though he had been doing mostly indoor professional work for a decade. He was polite. He offered tea and made it himself from the small gas ring in his kitchen. He listened to her explain why she had come without interrupting her, and then, when she finished, he was quiet for a period she estimated at close to a full minute. Not awkward silence, considered silence, the kind of silence that has a structure to it. He told her he could not discuss the Fayette County events. He said this without apology or elaboration. He said it the way a physician might decline to discuss a patient's case, not with the discomfort of someone who is afraid, but with the composed firmness of a professional judgment. Pemberton asked him why. He looked at her for a moment and said precisely, because the information would not help anyone who is still living, and it would cause harm to people who deserve to be left in peace. She asked him if he meant the families of the missing men. He said he meant several categories of people, and he did not specify further. She asked him about the Fairchild account, the written document he had submitted to the company. She asked him if he would at minimum confirm its existence. He said, without hesitation, yes, it exists. And then he said with equal composure, I would ask you not to pursue it. Pemberton asked him once more, near the end of the meeting, what had happened in those weeks at Dunbarton Hollow. She said she asked it simply, as plainly as she could, person to person, without the professional framing. He looked at her for a long time. She wrote that she had the overwhelming impression that he was evaluating something. Not whether to trust her, but something more complex than that. Whether telling her would cost more than it saved. Whether the arithmetic of it worked in a way he could accept. He said finally, "There are things that a person can know and still function, and there are things that do not allow for that." He paused. "What I know belongs in the second category. I have spent a great deal of effort ensuring that I am the only one who carries it." He walked her to the door. He thanked her for coming. He closed the door very quietly behind her. Pemberton returned to her notebook that evening and wrote for 3 hours. She compiled everything she had gathered on the case, the Fairchild report, the sheriff's inquiry, Dr. Reinhardt's examination notes, the wagon driver Aldrich's statement, the accounts from colleagues and neighbors. She organized it, annotated it, and labeled the notebook. She never published any of it. In a note inside the front cover, in pencil, she wrote, "He asked me not to pursue it. I find I cannot do so with a clear conscience, which is its own kind of information. Whatever he is protecting, he believes the protection is the ethical choice. I am not certain enough that he is wrong." What Pemberton did not know in 1919, what no one at that time could have known, was that the Fairchild account was only one of the documents that Voss had worked to suppress. In the years following his return, Voss had, with a patience and methodical thoroughness that was entirely consistent with his professional character, traced and addressed each instance where a record of the Dunbarton Hollow events threatened to become public or accessible. The full count of these instances, the suppressed documents, the withdrawn statements, the quietly closed accounts, reaches across the historical record as it has been reconstructed by researchers since the 1970s, to exactly 21. They are not all dramatic. Some are procedural and minor on their surface, but taken together as a body of effort sustained across more than 2 decades, they represent something remarkable. Not the act of a man in panic, the act of a man with a plan. The second secret was the medical examination report from Dr. Reinhardt. The version in the Fayette County Medical Society archive, the one that has been quoted in this account, is a summary. Reinhardt's original examination notes were more extensive. A researcher named Dr. Carol Vasquez, working in 1984 on a study of industrial accident psychology in early 20th century Appalachia, located a reference to the full Reinhardt notes in a correspondence file at the Medical Society and found that the original document had been removed from the archive sometime before 1930. The removal was recorded, with minimal detail, in the archive's accession log. The log records the removal as having been made by the subject's representative, a phrase with no further elaboration. No lawyer's name, no date beyond the decade designation. The third and fourth secrets were statements made by 2 men who had worked at Dunbarton Hollow in the season before Voss's team arrived, the prospecting crew that had occupied the camp structures the previous year. One of those men, a geological surveyor named Ben Casper, had spoken to a reporter from the Uniontown Evening Standard in 1908 about the area around the proposed mine site. His remarks, which touched on certain characteristics of the terrain and the underground water table in the hollow, were published in a brief article that was subsequently, and this is documented in the paper's own editorial archive, killed after its first edition run on the instruction of an unnamed party communicating through the paper's legal counsel. The plates for that edition were reportedly reset, and subsequent pressings of the same edition carried a different, shorter article that made no reference to the terrain specifics Casper had described. A single copy of the first-run edition survives in a private collection. Casper's formal deposition to the sheriff's inquiry, which should have been part of the inquiry file but was not in the folder Pemberton examined, is the fourth secret. It was apparently made and then withdrawn. The withdrawal is referenced in a handwritten notation in the inquiry file's index page, a notation that is easy to miss because it is written in pencil in the margin rather than in the formal type of the official record. The notation reads only, "Casper statement, withdrawn by deponent, October 1908. Voss had been back in Pittsburgh for 6 months by October 1908. The fifth through ninth secrets concern the families of the three missing men. Thomas Greer had a mother living in Greensburg and a sister in Philadelphia. Paweł Szczepanski had a wife and two children in the Polish immigrant community in Pittsburgh's Strip District. The guide, R. Holloway, whose full name was Robert Clarence Holloway, though this took researchers until the 1990s to establish definitively, had a brother farming land outside of Ohiopyle. Each of these family members, in the years between 1908 and 1915, received a letter. The letters do not survive in their entirety. 3 were described by descendants interviewed by researchers in the 1980s. 1 was partially quoted in a letter written by Szczepanski's daughter to a cousin in Poland in 1922, and 1 was mentioned in a diary kept by Holloway's brother. Each letter, by all accounts, said substantially similar things: that the writer had known the deceased, that he was sorry for the family's loss, that the man had died in a manner that was, in the writer's assessment, not painful, that there were circumstances surrounding the death that the writer was not in a position to disclose, and that he believed disclosure would not serve the family's peace or honor the memory of the man they had lost, and that the writer had provided, or intended to provide, a modest sum of money to each family. Amounts that the surviving accounts suggest ranged from $200 to $400, which in 1908 to 1915 terms represented several months of a working man's wages. None of the letters were signed with a full name. They were signed in each case with the initial E. The Szczepanski family, who were in the most precarious financial position, kept their letter the longest. It was eventually lost, the daughter wrote, in a house fire in 1931. She remembered it clearly enough to quote one sentence to her Polish cousin in the 1922 letter. He said the man who caused the trouble was no longer able to cause trouble to anyone, and that this should be some comfort, though he understood if it was not. The man who caused the trouble. Researchers who have worked on this case in the decades since Pemberton's notebooks became accessible have spent considerable effort on this phrase, because it is the one sentence in all of the surviving records surrounding Dunbarton Hollow that implies a human cause for the deaths of Greer, Szczepanski, and Holloway. Every other description of the events is conspicuously mechanism-free. The Fairchild Report does not describe a cause. The sheriff's inquiry, thin as it is, records only the absence of the men, not a theory of their fate. Dr. Reinhardt's examination of Voss, while noting his physical and psychological state, does not record a narrative explanation for what had occurred. The phrase in the Szczepanski letter is the only indication in any surviving document that what happened at Dunbarton Hollow was not purely an accident of terrain or weather or any other impersonal natural force, that there was someone involved, a person, an agent with intention, and that by the time Voss wrote the letters, that person was dead. There are, among researchers who have studied this case, 3 principal theories about who this person was and what occurred during the weeks between the 8th of April and the 24th of April 1908 at the camp near Dunbarton Hollow. The first theory, and the most straightforward historically, centers on Robert Holloway, the local guide. Holloway was, as researchers established in the 1990s, a man with a complicated history in Fayette County. He had been associated, in the years between 1895 and 1905, with a group of men involved in a series of land disputes and at least one violent confrontation in the hill country east of Connellsville. A Fayette County court record from 1903 documents a civil case in which Holloway was named as a party to a property boundary dispute that had escalated to physical violence. One man was hospitalized. He was not criminally charged, but the record suggests he was known to local law enforcement as someone capable of serious interpersonal violence when he believed his interests or his pride were threatened. This theory holds that Holloway, for reasons now unrecoverable, turned violently on the survey team during the weeks at Dunbarton Hollow, that Greer and Szczepanski died as a result of this violence, that Voss, either through force or circumstance, was responsible for Holloway's death, and that the physical evidence of this, the worn nails, the healed abrasions, the sustained weight loss, reflects the ordeal of surviving and managing the aftermath of a violent episode in an isolated location, without assistance, for an indeterminate number of days before Aldrich's arrival. This theory is consistent with the available physical evidence. It is consistent with the Szczepanski letter's reference to the man who caused the trouble. It is consistent with Voss's statement that the other men will not be coming back, a statement that, in this reading, includes Holloway in the count. And it is consistent with the pattern of suppression that followed, in which Voss's primary concern appears to have been ensuring that the story of what had happened, including his own role in ending Holloway's life, however justified, never became a matter of public or legal record. The second theory is structurally similar, but involves a different antagonist. It centers on the geology of Dunbarton Hollow itself, specifically on Ben Casper's suppressed newspaper remarks about the terrain and the underground water table. Casper, in the surviving first-run edition of the Uniontown Evening Standard article, had apparently described certain characteristics of the hollow that suggested the presence of unstable underground formations, a network of natural caverns or subsidence zones created by centuries of water erosion through the local limestone. He had noted that the previous prospecting team had encountered what he called unusual underground resonance in certain areas near the planned shaft site, a description that in geological terms suggests the presence of large subsurface voids. He had expressed concern, apparently, that the planned mine shaft was being sited on ground that might not be stable enough to support the excavation. In this second theory, what happened at Dunbarton Hollow was a sudden and catastrophic ground collapse, a sinkhole event or subsurface void failure that killed Greer and Szczepanski and the guide either immediately or through subsequent entrapment underground. Voss, who was not present at the moment of collapse or who survived it through location or circumstance, then spent the following days, perhaps as many as 16, in the physical and psychological aftermath of having witnessed such an event and being unable, alone and without equipment, to do anything to recover the men or summon help in time for it to matter. The physical evidence of his condition, the worn nails, the abrasions, is in this reading consistent with an extended and ultimately futile attempt to dig through or into collapsed ground with nothing but his hands. The man who caused the trouble in this reading refers not to Holloway, but to someone within the Fairchild Company hierarchy. A manager or engineer who had overridden or ignored Casper's concerns about the site's stability, who had insisted on proceeding with the survey and the planned shaft location despite warnings, and who was, by the time Voss wrote the letters, dead in the ordinary sense of having died before the letter was composed, perhaps from unrelated causes. This theory accounts for the Fairchild Company's extreme interest in suppressing Voss's written account and Casper's statement, because both documents would have implicated the company in a preventable disaster and exposed it to substantial liability for the deaths of 3 employees. The third theory is the one that researchers approach with the most methodological caution and discuss with the most intellectual discomfort, not because it involves anything that cannot be explained naturalistically, but because what it implies about Voss himself is more difficult to absorb. This theory holds that the cause of the deaths at Dunbarton Hollow was Edmund Voss, not through malice, not through premeditated violence, but through some act or sequence of acts committed in a state of extreme psychological crisis, a break, a dissociation, a moment or period in which the methodical, controlled interior man, who had spent his adult life carefully containing himself, ceased to be able to maintain that containment. And what was released in that failure was something that cost 3 men their lives. The evidence for this theory is entirely circumstantial and inferential, but the inference has a disturbing coherence. Consider, Voss is the only person who was present for the entire duration of events and who survived. He is the only person with the means, the intelligence, and the demonstrated long-term organizational capability to have orchestrated the degree of suppression that followed. His letter to the families specifically does not say that Holloway or anyone else killed the men. It says that the man who caused the trouble is no longer able to cause trouble. If Voss himself was the cause, then the most accurate thing he could write to the families would be that the man responsible was gone. contained, controlled, buried under years of deliberate self-management. His refusal to discuss events with Dr. Reinhardt, with Florence Pemberton, with anyone, has been interpreted as the behavior of a man protecting external secrets. But it may equally be the behavior of a man protecting an internal one. His statement to Pemberton, "What I know belongs in the second category, the category of things that do not allow for normal functioning," is, in this reading, not a description of terrible external information. It is a description of terrible self-knowledge. And the phrase he used to Pemberton, "I have spent a great deal of effort ensuring that I am the only one who carries it." A man who was present at, but not responsible for the deaths of his colleagues, would more naturally wish, over time, to share that burden with a priest, a physician, a trusted friend. The grammar of grief generally moves outward, seeking witness, seeking acknowledgement. Voss's grief moved inward and stayed there, and he spent decades engineering the walls. Florence Pemberton died in 1941 at the age of 48 of pneumonia. She did not publish anything about the case in her lifetime. Her notebooks were in a locked box in her apartment on Penn Avenue, left to the Carnegie Library in her will, along with her other papers. Edmund Voss died on March 2, 1938, in the Colwell Street apartment at the age of 63. He died of cardiac arrest. Mrs. Calvert had been gone by then. She had sold the building and retired to Braddock in 1929, and the building was under different management. The man who found Voss was the building superintendent who had come upstairs to check on a water pipe. The apartment was, by all accounts, exactly as it had always been. The drafting table, the books, the river stones on the windowsill, still arranged in their geological categories. On the table there was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a document of 11 pages, handwritten in the same clean, economical script of the early field journal entries. Though the letters were slightly larger now, the hand of an older man. The document was addressed to no one by name. It was sealed with wax, but the seal had been broken, either by the building superintendent when he found it, or by someone before him. The sequence of this matters, and has never been satisfactorily resolved. The 11 pages are the 16th of the 21 secrets. They are now held in a private collection that has declined for decades to permit full scholarly access, offering only summaries prepared by an unidentified third party. Those summaries describe the document as an account of events at Dunbarton Hollow in April of 1908, in the nature of a confession or testimony. The summaries do not specify what is confessed or testified to. They say only that the document clarifies the circumstances of the deaths of Thomas Greer, Pavel Szczepanski, and Robert Holloway, and that the author requests that the document be destroyed after reading. It was not destroyed. It is in a box, in a climate-controlled storage facility behind the decisions of an estate that has changed hands twice and currently belongs to the grandchildren of a Pittsburgh attorney who came into possession of the document in the 1950s through means that are themselves somewhat opaque. Multiple requests for access have been declined with identical language. The contents are considered private and not suitable for general publication. The estate declines to confirm whether the private collection that holds the document is the same private collection that was known to scholars in the 1980s, or whether the document has changed hands again since then. The remaining secrets, the 17th through the 21st, are items of smaller magnitude but peculiar character. The 17th is a page missing from the Fayette County Land Survey Register for 1907 and 1908. Specifically the page that would have recorded the formal survey of the parcel on which the Dunbarton Hollow camp was situated. The page was apparently removed at some point before 1920 because it is absent from the earliest known catalogue of the register's contents conducted in that year. The 18th is a notation in the Pittsburgh Presbytery's membership records showing that Voss made a financial contribution of $1,000 to the church's charitable fund in 1909, an amount, adjusted for the period, that represents approximately 3 months of his professional salary, with a handwritten annotation reading, "In remembrance." No names are recorded with this notation. The 19th is a letter from Voss to the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, dated 1912, that the office's archive contains only a single line of response to a formal acknowledgement that a letter had been received and reviewed by the relevant party, the original letter itself having been removed from the correspondence file. The 20th is a gap in the Hadley and Sons personnel records for the period 1916 to 1918, during which Voss appears, based on external references, to have taken an unpaid leave from the firm of approximately 4 months. No record of what he did during those 4 months, or where he went, has been found in any archive, and the 21st secret is perhaps the most disturbing in its simplicity. In the Carnegie Library's Pennsylvania room, among Florence Pemberton's donated papers, there is one of her research notebooks, not the Voss notebook, but an adjacent one, covering her work in the same period, that contains a single entry referencing Voss directly. The entry is dated November 1921, 2 years after her meeting with him. It reads, "Received a letter this morning without a return address. Pittsburgh postmark. 3 lines. He says he has been reading my published work and that he wants me to know that he has been following my career with interest. He says he would ask that I continue to honor the request he made in our meeting. He signs it only E. He knows where I work." She was writing about a man who had looked up her published journalism, tracked her professional movements over a 2-year period, and sent her a letter with no return address. A letter that was, on its surface, polite and even collegial, but that carried within its 3 brief lines a very specific message: that he was watching, that he was still actively invested in the silence around Dunbarton Hollow, and that he understood her to be the most likely person to break it. Pemberton never wrote about Voss publicly. She died 20 years after receiving that letter. Her notebook sat locked in a box for 26 years before arriving at the Carnegie Library, and the 11-page document in its private collection has now been sealed in various hands for 85 years. What do we do with a story like this one? What is the responsible act at this distance in time, when the people involved are all long dead, when the families of the missing men are now several generations removed from the grief, when the landscape of Dunbarton Hollow has long since been absorbed back into the forested hill country of Fayette County, the mine never completed, the camp structures collapsed and rotted into the ground? There is a school of historical thought that says distance is always clarifying, that what is too painful to examine closely becomes, over time, simply material, information to be catalogued, analyzed, understood, that the ethical obligation to truth eventually supersedes the private requests of the dead. There is another school of thought that holds that Voss was himself a kind of historian, a man who made a careful and sustained argument through his actions across 30 years for a particular kind of mercy, who decided with full cognizance and considerable effort that some truths cost more than they illuminate, who spent his professional savings sending money to 3 bereaved families and asked them, in letters he declined to sign, to find what comfort they could in an assurance he could offer, that the source of their loss was gone. He was not a hero in any conventional sense of the word. The evidence, depending on which theory you find most compelling, suggests that his actions at Dunbarton Hollow range from survival to culpability. He was not a monster either. The letters, the payments, the decades of disciplined self-containment argue against simple cruelty. What he was, perhaps, was something more unsettling than either of those categories. He was a man who looked directly at whatever had happened in those 16 April days in the wooded hollow country of Fayette County, understood it completely, and made a series of consecutive, rational decisions to ensure that it would die with him. He largely succeeded. The 11 pages on the table in the apartment on Colwell Street remain unread by any scholar. The sealed envelope was broken. By whom? Before whom? For what purpose? And no answer survives. The document that Voss spent his life preventing from becoming known is now preserved, with some irony, in climate-controlled archival conditions, by people who will not read it, but will also not destroy it. There is a particular cruelty in that outcome that Voss himself might have recognized. He asked for destruction. He received preservation. The secrets he spent 30 years burying are now physically intact, sealed in a box somewhere in Pennsylvania, waiting for someone to make a decision that Voss already made, and that whoever holds the document has so far declined to override. The river stones on his windowsill were still arranged by geological category when the building superintendent found him. He had been dead for approximately 18 hours. The room was cold, the window slightly open, the stones exactly where they had always been. Small, dense objects collected from a life spent measuring things. Proof that whatever had broken in him in April of 1908 had not broken his attachment to order, to classification, to the discipline of putting like things with like and maintaining the arrangement. In the geological typology that Voss understood, there are formations that develop under conditions of extreme pressure over enormous spans of time, and the result is a material so compressed that it requires extraordinary force to fracture. There are other formations that look identical on the surface, but are the product of slow water erosion rather than pressure. And these, despite their apparent solidity, are honeycombed inside with voids, with hollow space, with passages that have no visible entrance from the surface. The researchers who have spent careers on this case disagree about which kind of formation Edmund Harlan Voss was. And the only person who could have told us is the one person who spent his entire adult life making certain that no one ever got close enough to look. The 11 pages are still in their box. They have been there for 85 years. And the question that haunts everyone who has spent time with this story is not what they contain. It is simpler and more unanswerable than that. It is this: did he leave them because he wanted them found eventually by someone who could bear the weight of them? Or did he leave them because in the final hours of his life he simply ran out of time to destroy them? We do not know. We cannot know. And perhaps that uncertainty, that permanent, irresolvable gap in the record, is exactly what Edmund Voss intended to leave behind.